I have with me today a very interesting group of students of objectivism from the University of Arizona, visiting with me here in Los Angeles to ask some very provocative questions, both in the field of psychology, ethics, and I think politics are themes you want to get into today. Before we begin, I'd like to say a couple of words to the listeners of the seminar recordings. These recordings, ladies and gentlemen, are almost always done in my living room. It's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles. However, occasionally there are airplanes flying overhead, which I don't have the power to prevent. And on past occasions doing these recordings, when a plane was flying overhead, we would sometimes stop the recorder, wait till the plane passed, and then resume, which made it a bit of a strain and tended sometimes to interrupt the free, spontaneous continuity of the discussion. So today I have decided to ignore the planes unless they really become loud, and just think of it as a bit of background realism. We're sitting here in a beautiful glass-enclosed living room on top of a mountain in Beverly Hills, and far away in the distance we can see the Pacific Ocean, and if occasionally there are sound effects of an airplane, that will just help you to visualize the scene. Okay, let's begin with the first question.
Mr. Branden, psychiatrist Thomas Szasz has criticized the term, quote, mental illness, unquote, as it is commonly used by psychiatrists and psychologists because it labels nonconformists and people who have problems in living as, quote, sick, unquote, or in some way diseased. Do you have similar objections to this terminology?
Not entirely. I disagree with Dr. Szasz on this issue. In other words, I do accept the validity of the concept of mental illness, although I certainly do agree with him that sometimes this term can be used to smear or attack people who represent ways of thinking or positions that deviate from accepted ones. There seems to be a very undesirable tendency for people to want to smear anybody with whom they disagree as neurotic or psychotic or mentally ill. And insofar as Dr. Szasz is protesting against that kind of trend, I'm with him entirely. But on more theoretical grounds, if you ask me, do I think there is validity to the concept of mental illness, then my answer is yes, and I give my reasons in The Psychology of Self-Esteem. In his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, Dr. Szasz is taking up a different notion of mental illness in terms of departure from cultural or social norms that has nothing to do with the concept of mental illness as I discuss it. My approach, as you will remember, is entirely biological. I view the subject in terms of a mind's method of functioning deviating in a basic and somewhat institutionalized way from the survival requirements of the organism. If the mind or consciousness has a basic role to play in human survival, as of course it does, and if it can function in ways which serve the interests and survival of the organism, or if on the other hand it can be obstructed or blocked or distorted in function in such ways as to make good reality contact impossible, then we can describe these respective states as healthy mental functioning or unhealthy mental functioning. And I think, therefore, the task is not to abolish the concept of mental illness, but to reconceive it along the lines I discuss in The Psychology of Self-Esteem. Yes?
Mr. Branden, is there a relation between mental activity and physical vitality? For example, Howard Roark slept little, was enthusiastic about every moment of his waking hours, enjoyed the tension created by problem solving, etc. If so, to what degree?
I can't give a clear-cut yes or no answer to that question. Certainly, people who are highly motivated, who are in love with what they are doing, and who enjoy doing it, tend, generally speaking, to generate high levels of energy which they have to expend in the pursuit of their goals. On the other hand, you mentioned such a thing as how much a person sleeps. Now, there may be innate differences among people in their need of sleep, which have nothing to do with the level of their mental activity or their creative enthusiasm. In other words, this is a question to be settled by scientific research, and I don't think at this time an exhaustive or comprehensive answer exists, and therefore I can't give it to you. Obviously, very often when people are depressed, repressed, frustrated, dissatisfied with their lives, one of the consequences or symptoms is a great deal of fatigue, exhaustion, which is not physical but psychological. And this would tend to lend credibility to the idea that if we are engaged in enthusiastic, pleasurable mental activity, we usually have a high degree of physical energy at our disposal. But you couldn't draw any direct correlation and state with conviction that if there is high-level mental activity and enthusiasm for it, there is always very little need for sleep. You see, that just wouldn't follow. That remains a subject of scientific investigation. All we can observe to date, as I've already indicated, is that when people are dissatisfied, when they are frustrated, they often retreat into or collapse into a fatigue or an exhaustion or a lack of energy or an excessive need for sleep that appears physical but that is really psychological. However, I am fairly certain that it will be established, and may already have been established, that even after you have allowed for all the psychological factors, there are still basic innate differences among human beings in how much sleep they require.
Mr. Branden, what is the relationship between the virtue of pride, not interpreting pride in a psychological sense, and the value of self-esteem, or are they the same?
No, they're not the same, and the differences between them are very much worth understanding. Now, pride as a virtue, not as a psychological state, means valuing one's own life, wanting the best for one's own life, both in spiritual and material terms, being willing to fight for the value of one's own life, refusing to treat oneself as a zero or a nonentity, or to give up or sacrifice or relinquish one's legitimate goals, needs, desires, and so forth. As such, this is an attitude toward one's own life, which if a person perseveres in, that is certainly going to contribute to his self-esteem, and it's hard to imagine a person being able to keep that attitude if he didn't also have psychological self-esteem. In fact, I would say he couldn't. However, self-esteem is a psychological condition. It's not a virtue that one can directly choose to enact. It's a state of internal confidence in one's ability to deal with the world, to deal with life, to meet the challenges of life, therefore confidence in one's mind, which means confidence in one's ability to think, confidence in one's ability to understand, intellectual self-trust, intellectual self-reliance, and also a sense of one's own worthiness, a sense of one's right to be happy, of one's right to enjoy values, of one's right to enjoy existence, to enjoy one's own life. So you see, those are two related but actually quite significantly different concepts.
Mr. Branden, does happiness involve something more than living consistently with a rational code of values? Is the psychological result of happiness necessarily going to come about if one adheres to a rational code of values?
You know, I'm tempted to say that is a question that almost anyone could answer for himself. Let me explain. It seems to me quite obvious that mere adherence to a rational code of values is not a sufficient condition to guarantee happiness. Example: for several years or for all of your life, you have been a thoroughly rational human being. On the way home from work one day, a brick falls on your head, the consequence of which is to render you permanently blind. When you finally arrive home, you learn that a fire has destroyed your home and killed your wife and children. Now, does it need to be argued that at the end of that day, and for some time thereafter, you are not going to be a happy man, however rational or moral you have been previously? The point I'm trying to make is that happiness depends on the satisfaction or fulfillment of our intimately important values. So your question might have been rephrased to say, if a person adheres consistently to a rational code of values, is it guaranteed that his most important needs, desires, values, and goals will be fulfilled?